I should have listened to the warnings. I should have paid attention to the stories. But I brushed them off as urban legends and tall tales meant to frighten kids around the campfire. Little did I know the horror that awaited me down that lonesome stretch of road. I should have known the moment I saw him that something was wrong. However, things were about to take a terrifying turn down a dark path I could have never anticipated. But at the time, I just thought he was being friendly. So I waved back. I was driving home from work late one night, as was typical for me as a night shift manufacturing employee. It was around 2 a.m. and the roads were fairly deserted, as you'd expect that time of morning. I was taking the rural route home to my small town, winding along back roads through dark forests and past empty fields. That's when I saw him up ahead on the side of the road, waving at me with an enthusiastic full-arm wave, like he was flagging me down. My first thought was that maybe his car had broken down and he needed assistance. So I smiled and gave a friendly wave back before slowing down, preparing to pull over. As I got closer, I could make out more details in the glow of my headlights. He was standing perfectly still, body angled forward to face my approaching car. His other arm hung limp at his side. He wasn't wearing a jacket, even though it was a brisk autumn night. I rolled down my window a crack, ready to ask if he needed help. That's when I noticed his expression. It wasn't a friendly smile or look of relief at someone stopping. His eyes were wide and vacant, mouth hanging open ever so slightly. He just stared. As I passed, my headlights illuminated his face for a split second, and I could have sworn I saw his cheeks twitch into a slight smile. But it was gone in an instant, replaced with that same eerie blankness. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly rolled the window back up, locking the doors. There was something deeply unsettling about this stranger, like he wasn't quite human. An unearthly presence emanating from those dead eyes and twisted grin. I couldn't put my finger on what it was, but every instinct screamed at me to get away from him as fast as possible. I hit the gas, leaving the waving man behind me. The sound of my tires spinning on loose gravel filled the eerie silence surrounding my car. I stole a glance in the rearview mirror and saw him gradually shrinking into the distance, that arm still robotically waving as I sped away. A sense of dread washed over me, and I turned up the radio to drown out the uneasy quiet, trying to put the bizarre encounter out of my mind. I kept checking my mirrors constantly now, half expecting to see that ghastly figure trailing behind me. But the roads remained empty and still. Before long, I was pulling into my driveway and rushing inside, letting out a deep breath as I locked the front door behind me. I tried to convince myself I had imagined things, and it was just a strange person out for a late walk, though a nagging fear still gnawed at the back of my mind. But I couldn't shake this nagging sense of dread, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. Over the next few days, I found myself driving extra cautiously along that same desolate stretch of road, gripping the steering wheel tightly, eyes straining into the darkness, half expecting to see him again. At first, it was just my mind playing tricks, shadows and shapes blurring past that momentarily resembled a human figure, making my heart leap into my throat. But then he started appearing again, far off in the distance at first, just a small silhouette visible under the dim glow of the moon, waving casually, not moving, almost like some sort of mirage. Night after night it continued. He was there, clear as day now, in different spots along that same desolate road. Legs unnaturally still, torso arched forward, arm raised in that chillingly casual wave. Never approaching, never acknowledging me beyond that simple gesture, just waving, waiting. Each time I'd press my foot down on the accelerator, desperate to speed past his waving silhouette. But no matter how fast I drove, he always maintained that same maddeningly slow, casual wave. His presence seemed to leach the life and color from everything around him, shrouding that stretch of road in a cloak of dread and despair. I found myself taking longer and longer routes home, trying to avoid him. But no matter which back roads I took, that solitary shape would eventually appear. It It was as if he knew my every move, the casual wave beckoning me towards some horrible destiny I could only begin to imagine. The worst was when it became clear he was moving closer to my home, night by night, getting nearer and nearer to the turnoff I took to my small rural neighborhood. One night, I even saw him at the end of my street when I pulled in, arm robotically waving as I sped past. Terror gripped me as I slammed my car door and bolted inside, locking it behind me. I frantically closed all the blinds and curtains, shutting out the night. But I could still picture him out there, slowly drifting up my driveway with that same unbroken wave. With each passing day, the dread grew more unbearable. I had horrific nightmares. I was stuck in that car on a never-ending loop. The waving man always there, no matter which way I turned, waving insistently as that vacant-eyed figure drew nearer and nearer, summoning me towards an awful fate I couldn't see, but could feel closing in all around. I awoke in a cold sweat, my sheets drenched and tangled around me like shackles. I missed days of work, stopped going out after dark entirely, shuttered all the windows and draped blankets over them for good measure, just hoping and praying this haunting would pass, that the waving man would move on and leave me be. But in my heart, I knew that wasn't going to happen. Sure enough, one night I was awoken by the sound of something scraping against the front door downstairs. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or a tree branch blown by the wind, but the noise persisted. A slow, rhythmic scraping that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I held my breath, straining to listen. More scraping and tapping, slow and rhythmic, like fingernails or twigs being dragged along the wooden surface. It went on for what felt like hours as I lay there, petrified. Until, finally, I heard the front door unlatch and creak open. The footsteps that followed chilled me to my core. Heavy, shuffling steps at an unbearably slow pace, making their way through the house, up the stairs, down the hallway towards my bedroom. I stared in frozen terror as the shadows shifted under the crack at the bottom of the door. Suddenly, my bedroom door came crashing open, the force of the impact sending it slamming against the wall with a tremendous crash. And there he stood in the dim glow of the hallway light. A tall, arched silhouette now visible, arm raised as if in a wave. The waving man. Only now he was grinning that horrible, unnatural grin. His body was hunched forward, head sagging. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, back arched unnaturally and arms hanging slack at his sides. That's when the smell hit me. A thick, rancid odor like decaying flesh, wafting from the man, now only a few feet away. I shrank back on my bed, bile rising in my throat. That's when the nightmares took on a new, waking form. I'm not sure what happened over the next few hours. I awoke sometime later, covered in sweat and my own blood. Just fragments and impressions. A rancid smell enveloping me, like something discarded and left to rot. I could barely move. I started dragging myself towards the window, desperate to alert someone, anyone, before it was too late. That's when I saw him again. The waving man, he was standing right outside my house, smiling that awful grin and waving casually. Only now, his gaze drifted over in my direction. His grin widened, and he let out a horrible bellowing laugh that reverberated through my bones. As everything faded to blackness, with the last of my fading strength, some animalistic instinct took over. I raised a trembling hand and waved back. I don't know how long I stood there waving ceaselessly. Only one thought persisted through my distorted, macabre existence. There would be others, and like me, they would wave back. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when my life took a turn into the abyss. The day had been unremarkable, a tedious shift at the office, followed by a quick stop at the grocery store for some instant noodles and a loaf of bread. As I stepped out of the store, the first drops of rain began to fall, quickly escalating into a torrential downpour that turned the world into a blurry gray watercolor. I cursed under my breath, realizing I'd forgotten my umbrella at home. Pulling up the hood of my thin jacket, I made a dash for the bus, stopped just down the street. The rain was relentless, soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. By the time I reached the shelter, I was drenched, my shoes squelching with every step. The bus stop was one of those old-fashioned ones, a simple bench under a rusted metal awning that offered little protection from the wind-driven rain. A flickering streetlight cast an eerie, sallow glow over the scene. I checked the schedule taped to the post. The next bus was due in 15 minutes. Shivering, I sat down on the damp bench and watched the rain hammer the pavement, creating a hypnotic rhythm that almost drowned out the distant rumble of thunder. As I sat there, a strange sensation crept over me. The streetlight flickered violently, plunging me into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. In those brief blackouts, I could have sworn I heard whispers, faint, indecipherable murmurs that seemed to emanate from the shadows around me. I shook my head, attributing the unsettling atmosphere to my overactive imagination and the dreary weather. But then, as another peal of thunder echoed through the night, I saw a pair of headlights cutting through the rain-soaked darkness, approaching from the direction where my bus usually came from. At first, I felt a surge of relief. An early bus, I thought, grateful for the chance to escape this increasingly unnerving bus stop. But as the vehicle drew nearer, that relief curdled into unease. This wasn't my usual bus, and as it drew closer, something felt off. It was red, a deep arterial red that seemed to absorb the feeble light rather than reflect it. The bus slowed to a stop before me, its brakes emitting a high-pitched squeal that set my teeth on edge. For a moment, it just sat there, engine idling with a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. I stared at it, transfixed. There was no route number displayed, no destination, just that unsettling red gleaming wetly in the rain. Then, with a pneumatic hiss, the doors swung open. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to wait for my regular bus. Before I could take it all in, "Last bus," came a voice from within. It was gravelly, deep. "You getting on or not?" The bus service might have been suspended due to the heavy rains, I thought to myself. But the rain was getting heavier still. A sudden gust of wind sent a spray of icy water into my face. Overwhelmed by the desire to be somewhere, anywhere else, I stood up and approached the open doors. The interior was dimly lit by a single bare bulb that swayed with the bus's movements. The seats were upholstered in the faded, worn-out fabric that might once have been burgundy. But what struck me most was the smell. A cloying mixture of mold, wet leather, and something else. Something coppery and organic that made my stomach churn. "Where's this bus headed?" I called out to the driver, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet interior. The driver didn't turn around. He was an old man, or at least I assumed he was from the hands gripping the steering wheel. He wore a cap pulled low over his face, shadowing his features. In the same gravelly, deep voice, "It goes where it's needed," he said, "where it's called." I wanted to ask more, to demand a straight answer, but something in his tone froze the words in my throat. Instead, I fumbled in my pocket for my bus pass, only to have the driver wave me away with a gnarled hand. "No charge," he wheezed. "Not for this ride." Unnerved, I made my way down the aisle. The bus was empty, save for a lone woman slumped in the back row. It was a woman, middle-aged, her face turned towards the window. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding. She's just sleeping, I told myself. She has to be. I chose a seat near the middle, as far from the woman as I could get without being too close to the unsettling driver. As I sat down, the doors hissed shut, and the bus lurched into motion. We drove through the rain-slicked streets, the tires sending up sprays of water that obscured the windows. I tried to track our route, but the landmarks I knew seemed to blur and shift in the downpour. Buildings looked alien and foreboding, glistening eerily through the rain. After what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes, I realized we were no longer in the city. The streetlights had given way to darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. The road beneath us had changed too. I could feel the bus jolt and sway as it navigated what must have been a dirt track. "Hey," I called out, my fear finally overcoming my reticence. "This isn't my stop. Where are we going?" The driver said nothing. I rose from my seat, intending to force my way to the front and make the driver turn around. But in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of his eyes, milky white orbs that held no iris, no pupil. They weren't the eyes of something living. Panic surged through me. I stumbled backwards, my hand groping for support. It found the arm of the woman in the back. Her skin was ice cold, with an unearthly chill that seemed to seep into my own flesh. As I recoiled, her head lolled to the side, revealing a face frozen in an expression of fear. A quiet gasp escaped my lips as I looked around and realized she wasn't alone. In the seats I'd thought empty, there were others. Men, women, children, all slumped in unnatural poses. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Let me out," I cried, my voice cracking with panic. "Please, just let me out." The driver turned to me then, his face finally revealed. It was a face that didn't belong to the realm of the living, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer that of an old man, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. "There is no out," the voices said. "Only forward, only where we're called." And then, through the rain-smeared windshield, I saw the scenery outside had disappeared, replaced with nothing but a thick, absolute darkness. I slumped to the floor, my will to fight draining away. How long we drove in that lightless void, I cannot say. Time seemed to warp and stretch, measured only by my own ragged breaths and the ceaseless rumble of the engine. But finally, after what felt like eons, I felt the bus slow and then stop. The doors opened with a hiss that sounded like a dying sigh. "Last stop," the chorus of whispers announced. "Everyone out." But I didn't move. Through the open doors, I saw not a platform or a street, but an impenetrable wall of fog. It was a mist like no other, dense, roiling, with an iridescent sheen that hurt my eyes to look at directly. One by one, the other passengers rose, their movements jerky and unnatural, and stepped off into that impossible fog. They vanished instantly, swallowed by the mist. I remained seated, my hands gripping the seat in front of me so tightly my knuckles turned white. Some primal instinct told me that if I stepped into that fog, there would be no coming back, no return to the world I knew. I would be lost, not just in body, but in soul. "I said everyone out," the whispers hissed, now with an edge of malice. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. "I won't go." For a moment there was silence, save for the soft hiss of the fog as it began to creep into the bus. Then suddenly, I felt something grab me. It tugged at me, trying to drag me toward the door. I screamed, kicking out and grabbing onto anything I could reach. The unseen entity pulled harder. I could feel my grip slipping, inch by inch. The fog was up to my waist now, its touch like 1,000 tiny needles against my skin. In desperation, I looked up and saw the driver staring at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes, those milky white orbs, now seemed to hold a glimmer of something. Pity? "You don't belong here," he rasped, his voice now singularly his own. "Not yet." And with that, the doors hissed shut. The fog retreated, driven back due to the doors shutting it out, or perhaps by the driver's cryptic declaration. I woke with a jolt. I was sitting at the bus stop, the same bus stop where this nightmare had begun. My clothes were soaked, my body aching as if I'd been thrown from a great height. Above me, the streetlight flickered, its glow now seeming warm and comforting. The rain had stopped. I stared out at the endless expanse of the inky black sea. The eerie silence broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull of our fishing boat. The air was thick with a dense fog that swirled around us, obscuring everything beyond the horizon from view. It was as if we were suspended in a void, isolated from the rest of the world. My name is Jack, and I've been a commercial fisherman for the better part of my life. Countless nights spent on the open water had hardened me to the peculiarities and occasional terrors that the sea could throw our way, or so I thought. This particular night, however, something was unsettling in the air. A palpable sense of dread that crept up my spine like icy tendrils. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it away as mere superstition. The gentle rocking of our fishing boat did little to soothe the growing sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. Beside me, my old deckhand Mick squinted into the darkness, his weathered face etched with concern. "You feel it too, don't you?" he spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the eerie silence that surrounded us. "Something ain't right, Captain." I nodded, trying to keep my composure. I feel it all right. There's something out there, Mick. Something not quite right." Mick's lined face contorted into a grim expression, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded waters with a mixture of fear and wariness. "I've been on these seas for longer than I care to remember, but I ain't never felt a chill like this before." We fell silent once more, the only sound the creaking of the boat's timbers as it rocked gently on the swell. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. My eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. That's when I saw it. A ghostly silhouette cutting through the inky blackness. My heart stuttered as the form solidified into the unmistakable hull of a ship, drifting dangerously close. "Starboard side!" I barked, grabbing the wheel and spinning it hard into port, narrowly avoiding a collision with the drifting vessel. As we pulled alongside the other ship, an eerie silence hung in the air. No lights, no crew on deck. Nothing but the creaking of its timbers and an unnatural stillness. It was as if the entire vessel had been abandoned, left to drift aimlessly across the vastness of the sea. "What in blazes happened here?" Mick murmured, his brow furrowed with confusion and a hint of fear. Before I could respond, the thick fog began to roll in, enveloping us in a dense, swirling mist that obscured everything more than a few feet away. The air grew heavy and oppressive, and a chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Batten down, lads," I called out gruffly. "Looks like we're in for a thick one. There's more than just the sea at play here tonight." As if on cue, a faint whisper seemed to drift through the mist, carried on the gentle breeze. At first, I thought it was merely the wind playing tricks on my mind. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they coalesced into a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs. "You boys hear that?" I growled out to my deckhands. Soren, one of my more experienced men, nodded slowly. "Hey, Skip, I hear it." The whispering rose and fell like waves on a restless shore. I squared my shoulders, trying to project more bravado than I felt. "Probably just the fog playing tricks is all. You'll be hearing banshees next, you daft sods." My words were rewarded with a feeble chuckle from the men. Better to laugh it off than let the dread take hold. The stories of old came flooding back to me, tales of cursed ships and vengeful spirits that stalked the depths, dragging unsuspecting sailors down to a watery grave. Davy Jones's locker, the sailors called it, a fate worse than death itself. As the whispers swirled around us, growing ever louder and more menacing, I caught sight of another abandoned vessel drifting through the fog, its sails tattered and torn. Then another and yet another, each one as silent and lifeless as the last. Mick's face was ashen as he stared at the apparitions all around us. "God's blood, it's like they're beckoning to us, Captain. Summit wants us to join their ranks out there in the gloom." I swallowed hard against the lump of primal fear constricting my throat, because the superstitious old salt was right. With each new, ravaged form slipping from the mists, that spectral whispering grew more insistent, more maddening. An inexplicable, visceral urge stirred within me to cast off from the relative safety of our boat and let ourselves become enveloped by that spectral fog. Fear gripped my heart like a vice, but I knew I had to keep my wits about me if if we were to survive this nightmare. "Keep about your work," I ordered brusquely, "and pay it no mind. We'll see our way clear yet." With a steadying breath, I spun the wheel hard to starboard, setting a course that would hopefully lead us away from the ghostly fleet that had us surrounded. The whispers grew more frantic, as if whatever malevolent force was behind them sensed our intent to escape. The fog seemed to press in closer, obscuring even the crew, leaving us adrift in the sea of impenetrable darkness. Suddenly, a faint noise pierced the stillness, a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was a sound that chilled me to the bone, a primal cry that spoke of ancient horrors and unspeakable depths. "What in God's name was that?" Mick's voice trembled, his already pale complexion turning ashen. Mick's terrified whimpers reached my ears, but I blocked them out, focusing all my attention on navigating through the treacherous waters. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee, to put as much distance between us and this cursed place as humanly possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the whispers began to fade, and the fog thinned ever so slightly. In the distance, I could make out the faint glimmer of the shoreline, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness that had nearly consumed us. With renewed determination, I pushed the engine to its limits, the boat cutting through the waves like a knife, carrying us ever closer to safety. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, we finally reached the harbor, our vessel battered but intact, our lives miraculously spared. Mick and the rest of the lads collapsed onto the docks, their faces ashen and bodies still trembling from the horrors we had endured. I too felt the weight of the night's events bearing down on me, a heaviness that seemed to seep into my very soul. In all my years on the sea, I had never encountered anything like what we had witnessed that night. The abandoned ships, the disembodied whispers, the oppressive fog. It was as if we had brushed up against something ominous, a malign presence that had tried to claim us out there in the foggy waters. A shudder ran through me, but I knew in my heart that this would not be the end of my days on the sea. A fisherman's life is inextricably tied to the ocean, for better or worse. We live by the sea and die by the sea, beholden to its mysteries and its dangers. Mick seemed to sense my resolution, his eyes meeting mine with a grim understanding. "You ain't thinking of going back out there, are you, Captain?" he asked, his voice tinged with trepidation. I offered him a resolute nod. "Aye, lad, the sea is in my blood for all its terrors. We'll take on supplies, reinforce the hull, and set sail again come the next tide." Mick's shoulders slumped, but he didn't argue further. We had witnessed the horrors that lurked beneath the waves, but we were cut from a different cloth than most. The call of the ocean was one we could not resist, no matter the cost. As we made our preparations, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim determination settle over me. The sea had thrown its worst at us, and we had survived. Next time, we would be ready, prepared to face whatever evils lay in wait. If the sea claimed us, then that would be a fisherman's fate. You're probably wondering why I'm telling this story. Hell, I've asked myself that same question 1,000 times since it happened. But I can't keep it bottled up inside anymore. The nightmares, the visions, the creeping sense of dread that never goes away. I need to get it out there, and maybe, just maybe, that will allow me to begin healing from whatever the hell that was in the woods. It started out innocently enough. Just a weekend camping trip up in the mountains to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The 6 of us had been buddies since college, bonded by a shared love of outdoor adventures. So when Derek suggested we hit up a new camping spot near Miller's Creek for some hiking, fishing, and campfire beers, we all jumped at the chance. The winding mountain road seemed to stretch on forever as we made our way up the canyon, trees and cliffs enveloping us. An excited energy filled the truck, everyone swapping stories and razzing each other like we'd done 100 times before on these trips. Little did we know, we were venturing straight into the nightmarish unknown. After setting up our tents near the creek under a canopy of pines, we settled in for a night of camping revelry. A few too many cold ones around the crackling fire led to loud jokes and laughter, echoing through those once serene woods. I vaguely remember crawling into my tent as the embers died out, the muffled snores of my friends drifting across the campsite. But then, something startled me awake. A faint sound in the distance that instantly lanced through my inebriated haze like ice water. At first I thought maybe a coyote or some other small creature was roaming nearby. But as I lay there holding my breath, I realized this was no animal. It was an unmistakable, blood-curdling scream ripping through the silence of the night. A shriek so agonizing and primal that it made my stomach knot. I jolted upright, straining my ears for any other sound as my heart pounded in my chest. Had I imagined it? Was this some kind of twisted prank? Peering out through the tent flap, I could make out the shadowy forms of my friends' tents, unmoving and undisturbed. Just then, the scream tore through the air again, this time much closer and more harrowing. Without a second thought, I scrambled out of the tent and grabbed the nearest flashlight, its beam sweeping over the scrub brush and boulders near the creek. "Hello? Who's out there?" I yelled with as much bravado as I could muster. That's when I noticed it. A dim glow emanating from a spot near the water's edge, about 50 yards away, flickering and pulsating like a dying flame. As quietly as I could, I made my way toward this strange light, dread pooling in the pit of my stomach with each step. The beam of my flashlight soon revealed the source of the ghastly illumination, a series of candles scattered haphazardly along the rocky bank, some still burning while others appeared to have been snuffed out in haste. Circling around for a better vantage point, an even more hellish scene was unveiled before me. There, nestled against a gnarled tree trunk, was an ancient, cracked altar covered in dark stains and surrounded by scattered, flickering candles. The sinister glow cast eerie shadows on the forest floor, revealing symbols and runes etched deeply into the wood, suggesting rituals long forgotten yet ominously alive in this forsaken place. That's when I saw movement from the corner of my eye near the tree line. A shadowy figure emerging from the woods like a wraith. My heart seized in my chest as I watched this dark entity glide toward the altar with an unnatural, jerky gait. Despite its vaguely humanoid shape, there was something inexplicably unholy about this entity, like it was stitched together from the darkest of nightmares. "Oh God," I muttered under my breath, my flashlight suddenly feeling like a feeble shield against the primordial evil unfolding before me. In one deft motion, the shadowy creature snatched a rusted, ceremonial blade from atop the altar and began to carve into the ancient wood with deliberate, savage strokes. Each cut seemed to release a haunting echo of screams that penetrated my very soul, as if the altar itself were crying out in agony. Stunned by horror, I could only watch helplessly as this nightmare unfolded. The sound of the blade carving wood mingling with the whispers of the wind until they ceased altogether. Silence once again blanketed the woods, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The figure stood still for an eternal moment, clutching the blood-stained blade, seemingly savoring its sinister act. I wanted to run to escape the horror I had stumbled upon, but I was rooted in place, petrified, just as it felt like my sanity would shatter altogether. A bright light nearly blinded me, jolting me into action. I whipped my head around to see the beam of a flashlight sweeping crazily through the trees. It was one of my friends, delirious with sleep, but drawn towards the commotion. And with his emergence, the dreadful specter seemed to take notice of my presence at last. Suddenly, the creature's head snapped up and seemed to lock its soulless gaze directly on me, freezing the blood in my veins. In one terrifying motion, it turned and began lurching up the ravine straight toward me with that unnatural, disjointed stride, each powerful step covering far more ground than should have been physically possible. That's when the instinct of self-preservation finally kicked in. With a frantic shout to the others, I spun on my heels and sprinted back toward the campsite. panic fueling my every stride as I crashed through bushes and hurtled over fallen logs. Behind me, I could hear the abomination's disturbingly rapid footfalls closing in, snapping branches like twigs as it gave chase. By some miracle, I reached our campsite with the unholy beast still in pursuit. Praying desperately that all of my buddies are still here sleeping, I started frantically unzipping tents and shouting at the top of my lungs. "Wake up! Wake up! We've got to get out of here, now!" One by one, my groggy friends began to emerge. Fear and confusion etched across their faces at my frantic screams. That's when the first rocks and clods of dirt began to pummel us, a ghastly howl ripping through the night. The creature had arrived at the edge of our campsite, but it didn't charge into the fray. Instead, it stood there glaring at us with those black, lifeless pits where eyes should have been, the blade in its hand slick and dripping with an unknown liquid. My mind refusing to believe it could be anything other than blood. I tried to make out its features in the ambient light, but there was nothing remotely human about it. It was big, at least 8 feet tall, with a humanoid shape, but hunched over with large, elongated appendages. Its skin seemed to glisten like dripping muscle, raw and pulsating. I couldn't make out any distinct features, but its movements were jerky and unnatural, like its very existence went against the laws of nature itself. My friends were now fully awake, frozen in terror before the monstrosity stalking the edge of our campsite. No words passed between us, as if speaking might entice the creature closer and seal our fates. I don't know what finally made it turn. The entity let out one ear-splitting screech that felt like shards of ice piercing my brain. And then it turned and retreated in that same unnatural gait from whence it came, disappearing back into the shadows of the forest as quickly as it had first emerged. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one dared to speak as we frantically broke down camp and jammed our supplies into the truck, not knowing if the creature would return. Huddled inside the cab like frightened children, the only words uttered were whispers of desperate prayer that we'd make it out of those hellish woods alive. The truck's headlights finally pierced through the morning fog, and we caught our first glimpse of paved road in the distance. It was as if an invisible vice had finally released its grip on our souls. The rolling mountain highway stretched before us, beckoning us back to the light and logic of civilization. As we barreled down the mountain road and eventually back to civilization, no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we possibly say? How could any sane person comprehend what we just witnessed? That thing? So heed my warning, campers and outdoor folk. Some things dwell in the dark, forgotten recesses of the untamed wilderness. Tread carefully beneath those starry nights, friends, and pray that the veil between reality and the nightmare realm remains closed to you. Do you ever wonder if our modern social customs have made us unwittingly more susceptible to the threat of our ancient adversaries, the ones that have been our hidden cohabitants since the dawn of humanity? I was startled by a firm knock at my front door, just as dusk settled over the neighborhood. I felt a tremor of unease as I crossed the living room to answer it. A solitary figure stood on my porch, backlit by the fading twilight. A strikingly handsome man with an air of casual confidence. "Good evening," he said with a warm smile. "I'm new to the area, and it seems I've gotten myself a bit turned around. Could you perhaps help me with directions?" His voice was smooth as velvet, disarming in its friendliness. But there was an undercurrent of something else beneath the polished delivery, an intensity in those piercing eyes that unsettled me. "Of course," I replied, against my better judgment. "Where were you headed?" He tilted his head slightly, holding my gaze a moment too long. "Just looking for the downtown area. A wrong turn or two is all it took to get myself utterly lost, I'm afraid." I gave him cross-street directions, but he didn't turn to leave right away. An uncomfortable silence stretched out between us, thickening the air with some indefinable tension. He took a casual step forward. If it's not too much trouble, could I trouble you for a glass of water? It's been a dreadfully long drive. My instincts screamed to refuse, to shut the door tight, but his soft tone and easy charisma disarmed me. Surely one man alone could mean no harm, I thought to myself, despite the crawling sense of unease prickling my nerves. Of course, please come in, I heard myself say, as though disconnected with my rational judgment. Most kind you are. Thank you for allowing me into your home. Something about the way he said that last part caused the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up. But his charming demeanor quickly put me at ease, and I opened the door wider, stepping back to allow him to enter. He slipped through the door without waiting, the scent of his crisp cologne enveloping me as he brushed past. I struggled against the trance his presence seemed to weave. I headed to the kitchen as he made himself comfortable on the sofa. As I filled a glass from the tap, I noticed my hands were trembling slightly. I took a deep breath, willing myself to relax. Don't be so foolish, I chided myself. Nothing to be anxious about. I returned to find him admiring a family photo on the bookshelf, his eyes gliding over the familiar faces of my loved ones. You have a beautiful home, he mused, accepting the drink with a courteous nod of thanks. It has such warmth. Quite welcoming, really. I muttered an awkward thanks, suppressing a shudder at the subtle emphasis he put on that word, welcoming. From there, a peculiar shift seemed to take hold. One so gradual and insidious that I didn't even recognize it until it was far too late. As the hours stretched on, he nursed his glass of water with paradoxical slowness, despite my tacit cues that his welcome had passed. You know, it's grown dreadfully late, he remarked once the sky had long turned ink black outside the windows. And I'd hate to be out wandering strange streets at night in my present disoriented state. His eyes glided meaningfully toward the hallway leading to the spare bedroom, allowing an artfully awkward pause to dangle his unspoken request to remain overnight. I couldn't possibly impose, he demurred with a self-deprecating chuckle, carefully masking the glint of certainty that he would, in fact, be doing precisely that. There was an undercurrent of command beneath the polite veneer, a sense that rebuffing his query was not truly an option. I wavered, every self-preserving instinct screaming to refuse, to stand firm and eject this smooth-talking stranger from my home before matters went any further awry. But the words shriveled on my tongue, rendered impotent by the subtle alchemy of his unsettlingly charismatic poise. I suppose it's dreadfully late to be getting turned around again. I heard myself relenting with a sickly lurch of disbelief. The spare room is made up if you'd like. You have my gratitude. He cut me off with an insistent smile, already rising fluidly to his feet and trailing a proprietary hand along the spines of my bookshelves as he headed down the hall. Before I realized it, he deftly insinuated himself into my daily comings and goings. Yet, he remained unfailingly polite, so amiably personable that I couldn't bring myself to object to his outstaying his welcome. An undercurrent of unease rippled through me, but his very presence possessed an alluring, nearly hypnotic quality that dissolved any defiance. Perhaps it was his luxurious voice and refined enunciation as we conversed over cups of steaming Earl Grey, meticulously prepared at his insistence. Maybe it stemmed from his seemingly inexhaustible knowledge and philosophical insights during our discussions over world literature and historic arts that I so enjoyed. Gradually, without even marking the progression, his integration into my world became total. He grew so immutably intertwined into the fabric of my routine that I no longer could envision this space, my comings and goings, without his presence woven inextricably alongside. He became a seamless part of my world, and that, perhaps more than anything, sealed my utter undoing. Because it wasn't until the dead of one chilly midnight that the cruel game he'd been playing finally dawned on me in full. I awoke to the paralyzing realization that I was no longer the master of my own domain, but an obliviously willing host harboring something evil. As my eyes fluttered open, his towering silhouette dominated my field of view, stark against the moonlight spilling through the window. The polished marble of his chiseled features seemed to almost glow in the darkness. My breath seized in my lungs as his pale lips parted in a terrible half-smile. In that moment, the beguiling charisma had shed its human facade completely, leaving only the ravening predator behind those obsidian depths. "You fought admirably against my influence." His rich baritone reverberated against the walls, carrying a lilt of dark amusement. "But in the end, your mind proved just as fragile." Despite the cryptic words, an icy dread lanced my core as his true motivations became terribly clear. This was no chance encounter, but something more insidious lying in wait all along. A tremor racked my frame as he leaned forward, one frigid hand extending to trace the line of my jugular with disturbing tenderness. I could feel the feather-light scrape of sharpened nails against my flesh as his fingers trailed downward, reminding me who was rendered helpless beneath his dominion in this place. "To never extend hospitality to the unknown," he tisked in mild admonishment, "spoken of through fable and folklore alike. And yet you, modern mind, disregard the wisdom as mere myth. We've walked among you since the dawn of your civilization, you know, cloaked in fable and shadow, to be sure, but never merely confined to story." The unnatural chill of his touch froze me as his words slithered like noxious serpents through my numbing mind. His kind, here all along, dwelling within our oldest tales and subconscious? A sickening lurch churned within me as the full implications crystallized. He brushed my forehead in a parody of perverse intimacy, the predatory glint in his obsidian stare rendering the tender facade obscene. Jagged ivory fangs descended as it engulfed my world in an eternal darkness. Yet the true terror lingered in the harrowing realization that my thoughtless invitation had simply unveiled the perverse truth as old as humanity itself. We were never alone to begin with. The obscene secret had been lurking all along, just beneath the surface. I had just settled in for a quiet evening at home. I poured myself a drink and sank into my favorite armchair, ready to lose myself in a good book. That's when I heard a knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door, precise and authoritative. I glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. Far too late for any visitor. I considered ignoring it, but something about the purposeful nature of that knock compelled me to answer. I opened the door to find a man standing on my porch. He was tall and lean, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the porch light. His face was angular, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that appeared almost black in the shadows. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I apologize for the late hour, but I have an opportunity that I believe will be of great interest to you." A chill ran down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Everything about him seemed perfectly ordinary, and yet... "I'm not interested in buying anything," I said, moving to close the door. His hand shot out, catching the edge of the door. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Oh, but I'm not here to sell you anything, Mr. Thompson. I'm here to offer you a choice." I froze. I hadn't told him my name. The salesman's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "May I come in? I assure you this won't take long." Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door, to run, to call for help. But before I knew it, he glided past me, his movements unnaturally fluid. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to my own living room as if he were the host. I sank back into my armchair as he sat on the edge of the sofa. "Now then, Mr. Thompson, let's discuss your soul." My mouth went dry. I don't understand." "It's quite simple, really," the salesman said. reaching into his jacket and withdrawing a slim, leather-bound ledger. "I'm here to offer you a trade. Your immortal soul in exchange for, well, anything your heart desires." I laughed nervously. Is this some kind of joke? His eyes locked onto mine, and in their depths, I saw something ancient and terrible. "I assure you, Mr. Thompson, I never joke about business." He opened the ledger, and I gasped. The pages seemed to writhe and shift, filled with names written in a disturbing red ink. "Shall we begin negotiations?" "This isn't real," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It can't be." The salesman sighed, a sound like wind whistling through a graveyard. "Denial is a common first reaction, Mr. Thompson. But I assure you this is very real. Now, what is it you desire most? Wealth beyond measure? Power over others? Perhaps the return of a loved one?" At those last words, my breath caught in my throat. Memories of my brother, lost to an accident 5 years ago, flooded my mind. The salesman's eyes glittered, and I knew he had seen my reaction. "Ah, yes," he purred. "I can bring him back, healthy and whole, as if he'd always been here. All it will cost you is one little signature." He produced a fountain pen from thin air, its barrel gleaming like polished bone. I found myself reaching for it, drawn by an impulse I couldn't explain. "Wait," I said, pulling my hand back. "How do I know this is real? That you can actually do what you claim?" The salesman's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed just a bit too sharp. "An excellent question. A demonstration, perhaps?" He snapped his fingers, and the world around us shifted. The walls of my living room melted away, replaced by an endless expanse of swirling mist. Ghostly shapes moved within the fog, human figures, I realized, with growing horror. "Welcome to the Borderlands," the salesman said, gesturing to the eerie landscape. "The space between your world and, well, let's just say it's where souls await their final destination." A figure emerged from the mist, and I felt my heart stop. It was my brother, looking exactly as he had before the accident. He smiled at me, but his eyes were sad. "Hey, little bro," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "You shouldn't be here." The salesman cleared his throat. "As you can see, Mr. Thompson, I have access to powers beyond your comprehension. Your brother's soul is here, waiting. With a single signature, I can return him to the land of the living. A second chance at life. Isn't that worth any price?" Matt's expression turned to one of alarm. "Don't listen to him, Jake. Whatever he's offering, it's not worth it. You have to..." With another snap of the salesman's fingers, we were back in my living room. The sudden transition left me dizzy and disoriented. "Well," the salesman prompted, "have I sufficiently demonstrated my capabilities?" My mind reeled. Part of me still clung to disbelief, insisting this must be some elaborate hoax or hallucination. But deep down, I knew. I had seen my dead brother, had felt the chill of that otherworldly realm. This was real. He held out the pen again, his smile growing wider. "So, Mr. Thompson, do we have a deal?" I stared at the pen, my hand trembling as I reached for it. The chance to bring Matt back, to undo the tragedy that had torn our family apart, wasn't that worth any sacrifice? But as my fingers brushed the cool surface of the pen, I hesitated. Matt's warning echoed in my mind. What was I really giving up, and to whom? "Who? What are you, really?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The salesman's smile never wavered, but something dark and ancient stirred in the depths of his eyes. "I have many names, Mr. Thompson. In the end, does it really matter? I'm offering you everything you've ever wanted. The only question is, are you brave enough to accept it?" I withdrew my hand, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I need time to think about this." The salesman's smile tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Time, Mr. Thompson, is a luxury you may not have. My offer is for this night only. Come sunrise, this opportunity vanishes, along with any chance of seeing your brother again. A chill ran through me at his words. The thought of losing Matt forever, when I was so close to bringing him back, was almost unbearable, and yet... "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "No, I won't do it." The salesman sighed, a sound of deep disappointment. "Are you certain? Think carefully. This is your only chance." "I'm sure," I replied, setting the pen down on the coffee table. "Please leave." For a moment, the salesman was perfectly still. Then, slowly, his lips curved into a smile that made my blood run cold. "Oh, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice dropping to a silky whisper. "Who said you had a choice?" The room began to darken, shadows creeping in from every corner. The salesman stood, his eyes blazed with an infernal light, and when he spoke again, his voice reverberated with inhuman power. "Your soul is marked long ago, Jacob Thompson. Your soul is mine. Whether you sign willingly or not, I will take what I came for." Panic surged through me. I leapt from my chair, trying to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I screamed, thrashing against the shadowy bonds that held me in place. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare. It had to be. But as the shadows closed in, I felt something stir deep within me. A warmth blossomed in my chest, spreading through my body like liquid fire. Without thinking, I grasped the small medallion I always wore around my neck. A gift from my grandmother years ago. What is this?" the salesman hissed, his voice a mixture of pain and confusion. His eyes narrowed, studying me with a new intensity. That's quite unexpected," he mused, the shadows slowly sifting back and returning the room back to its original countenance. "It seems I underestimated you, Mr. Thompson. Or perhaps I underestimated the power of your lineage." He straightened his suit, composing himself. Though he appeared human once more, I could still see the otherworldly menace lurking behind his eyes. "Very well, then," he said, his tone businesslike once more. "Are you sure about your decision? This protection may shield you for now, but remember, I have eternity to wait. One day you may find yourself wishing you had taken my offer." I clutched the medallion tighter, drawing strength from its warm glow. "I'm sure," I replied firmly. "My soul is my own, and it's not for sale. Not now, not ever." The salesman regarded me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he turned toward the door. "As you wish, Mr. Thompson, but know this, our paths may cross again. And next time, you may not be so... fortunate." Pausing, he added, "Oh, and Mr. Thompson, do try to sleep well. The nightmares, well, they'll pass, eventually." With that, he stepped off the porch and walked down the path. I blinked, and he was gone. Vanished into the darkness as if he'd never been there at all. I never told anyone about that night. Who would believe me? But sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself glancing at the front door, half expecting to hear that familiar knock. And each time, I breathe a sigh of relief when it doesn't come. Because the next time, I might not be able to say no. I never believed in ghost stories. They were just tales to scare kids around campfires or entertain bored teenagers at sleepovers. But that was before I drove through the old Millbrook Tunnel. It was a few weeks back. I was driving home from a business trip, taking the scenic route through the mountains to clear my head after a stressful week. The autumn leaves were a riot of reds and golds, beautiful yet somehow melancholy under the fading light. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill mist began to rise from the valleys, curling around the trunks of ancient oaks and maples. The GPS suggested a new route, promising to shave 30 minutes off my journey. "Take the next right onto Old Mill Road," the robotic voice intoned. I hesitated for a moment. Old Mill Road wasn't on my usual route. People generally avoided it as it looked more like a forgotten dirt track than a proper road. But the prospect of getting home a whole 30 minutes sooner, of sinking into my own bed after a week of lumpy hotel mattresses, was too tempting. The road wound through dense forest, the branches of the trees meeting overhead to form a tunnel of deepening shadows. My headlights seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness, barely illuminating the path ahead. The mist thickened, swirling around my car like ghostly fingers, making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. That's when I arrived at the entrance to the tunnel. It looked ancient, deep, like the mouth of a slumbering beast. Carved into the rock face above were the words, Millbrook Tunnel, 1873. The stone was weathered, the letters half eroded by time and the elements. 2 old-fashioned lanterns flanked the entrance, their glass clouded and cracked. To my surprise, a faint yellow glow emanated from within. Someone must have lit these lamps recently, I wondered. I slowed the car to a crawl. Every instinct told me to turn around, to go back the way I came. But behind me, the road had disappeared into an impenetrable wall of mist. It was as if the world outside the reach of my headlights had ceased to exist. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized I had no choice but to go forward. The tunnel swallowed my car. The walls were damp, glistening in my headlights, like they were coated in some viscous fluid. Water dripped from the ceiling, splattering my windshield with drops that seemed too thick, too dark to be just rainwater. The air grew colder with each yard I drove, my breath fogging up the windows. It was then that I heard it, a whisper, soft and sibilant, emanating from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the tires on the wet stone. But as I drove deeper into the tunnel, the whispers multiplied, a chorus of hushed voices that seemed to be speaking words just beyond my comprehension. I hit the gas, desperate to get out of there, but the tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly. I should have been through it in a matter of minutes, but 10 minutes passed, then 15. Still, there was no sign of an exit. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They were speaking to me now, I was sure of it. "Stay with us," they seemed to say. "Don't leave us alone in the dark." My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I jabbed at the radio, hoping to drown out the voices with music or talk, anything. But all I got was static, a hissing, crackling noise that sounded horribly like mocking laughter. And then, in my rearview mirror, I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, pressing out of the walls like they were trying to break free from some invisible membrane. Their features were distorted, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and glassy. They reached out with gray, mottled hands trying to grasp at my car. I screamed and floored the accelerator. The car lurched forward, tires squealing on the slick stone. The faces rushed past in a nightmarish blur. I thought I felt a cold hand brush against the back of my neck, and I jerked away, nearly losing control of the car. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, that I'd either crash or the entities would drag me out of the car, I saw it. The exit, a small circle of starry sky framed by the tunnel's mouth. I burst out into the night air, gasping, my heart pounding like it wanted to escape my chest. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the tunnel was nothing but a bad memory. When I finally pulled over at a 24-hour diner, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely undo my seatbelt. The waitress gave me a concerned look as I stumbled in, but I waved away her questions. What could I say? That I'd been chased by ghosts? Over coffee that tasted like ash in my mouth, I pulled out my phone and searched for Millbrook Tunnel. What I found chilled me more than the tunnel itself. In 1873, during the tunnel's construction, there had been a cave-in. 57 workers were trapped inside. By the time rescuers broke through weeks later, all they found were bodies. The tunnel was eventually completed, but locals avoided it. There were stories of strange noises, of people going missing. The county had officially closed it in the 1950s. How had my GPS routed me through a tunnel that had been closed for over 70 years? Did they reopen it recently? I made it home that night, though I don't remember much of the drive. I was too busy checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those faces pressed against the glass. When I finally walked into my house, I locked every door, every window. I even pushed a bookshelf in front of the closet, though I couldn't have said why. The next morning, I called in sick. I didn't trust myself to drive. Didn't trust that my GPS wouldn't try to route me back through that accursed tunnel. Instead, I spent the day researching. The more I read, the more I realized that what happened to me wasn't unique. There were forum posts, blog entries, even a few local news articles. People telling stories eerily similar to mine. A college student who took a wrong turn and ended up in the tunnel, only to find that an hour had passed in what should have been a 5-minute drive. A trucker who swore he saw faces in his mirrors, whispering that they were so lonely, so cold. Some of the posts were years old, some just a few months. But here's the thing that really got to me. None of the blogs or stories of the person getting out of the tunnel were active. Most of them didn't even finish their stories. They all stopped mid-narrative, as if the writer had simply disappeared. Had they decided not to talk about it for some reason, or had something come for them? After a few days, I thought of driving again. As I turned on the car, my GPS also turned on. But on the screen was a map, a route plotted out in glowing blue. It led right back to Old Mill Road, right back to the tunnel. And here's the worst part. I'm tempted to follow it. Not because I want to, God no, but because ever since that night, I've felt incomplete. Like I left something behind in that tunnel. Something vital. The voices whisper to me in my dreams, reminding me. They say they're waiting for me. They say I belong with them. Catch myself staring down dark hallways, half hoping, half fearing to see those faces emerge from the walls. When I'm in the shower, the splash of water on tile sounds like their sibilant whispers. Come back, they say. You're one of us now. I'm fighting it. I've thrown away the GPS, but I'm afraid it won't matter. The tunnel found me once. It can find me again. I've thought about moving, about going somewhere far away. But I know, deep down, that distance won't save me. The tunnel isn't just a place. It's a hunger, a void that wants to be filled. And for some reason I can't fathom, it has chosen me. So, I'm leaving this account as a warning. If you're driving through the mountains and your GPS tells you to take Old Mill Road, don't. Because I think I know now why those other stories stopped, mid-sentence. It's not that something came for those people. It's that a part of them was left behind in the tunnel. And what was left just wanted to go home, back to the embrace of that tunnel. I'm writing this in my car. The GPS is on the seat next to me, the route to the tunnel glowing like a neon promise. My hands are shaking as I type this on my phone. I keep telling myself I'm not going to follow it. I'm going to drive in the opposite direction. Keep driving until I run out of road. But even as I write these words, I know it's a lie. The whispers are louder now. I can almost make out what they're saying. They're telling me it won't be so bad, that I won't be alone anymore. Part of me believes them. If you're listening to this, it means I've managed to upload it. It means that I'm already home, back where I belong, in the tunnel.